So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our 3 modules on genetic counseling supervision education. On behalf of both the Bay Path and the Boise State Genetic Counseling training programs, we're thrilled that you all could take some time today and attend the first of our seminars. I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping things first. Please be sure to keep your camera disabled and your microphone on mute so that it doesn't interfere with Pat. And please hold all your questions until the end. And at the end, you can use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask the questions. Everyone who's registered will get a copy of the slide deck and the recording so that you can have it for your files. Finally, afterward, you will get a quiz via email that you need to pass with an 80% to get the CEU credit, as well as course evaluations. And of course, we appreciate all your input. So the first of our series, our first speaker is Pat McCarthy-Veach. Pat is a licensed counseling psychologist. She is a distinguished teaching professor emerita at the University of Minnesota and an adjunct instructor in the Department of Genetics, Cell Biology, and Development at the University of Minnesota. She is a recipient of the Outstanding Contributions to Post-Baccalaureate, Graduate, and Professional Education Award at her university, and a recipient of the Minnesota Psychological Association Outstanding Graduate Faculty in Psychology Award. Her teaching and research involves supervision, training and professional development of human services professionals, and counseling process variables. She is the co-author of Facilitating the Genetic Counseling Process, Practice-Based Skills, Genetic Counseling Practice, Advanced Concepts and Skills, and Genetic Counseling Research, A Practical Guide. She has authored over 100 book chapters and professional articles. She is a former assistant editor of the Journal of Genetic Counseling, and we are thrilled to have Pat kick off our series with Genetic Counseling Supervision, the Basics. Pat, you can take it away.
Okay. Well, hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today, and I appreciate that you're sharing part of your Friday afternoon with me. I'm going to put the slides up here in a moment, and hopefully you'll be able to see them. And what I'm planning to do is give a broad overview of some select concepts to really lay a framework, I think, for the workshops or presentations that will be coming after mine. If you have paper and pencil or a pen nearby, you might want to pull that out, because periodically throughout the talk, I'm going to ask you to do a little reflecting and writing down some ideas for yourselves. I am going to have questions and answers, some time for that at the end of the talk today, so I'll ask you to hold those till the end. Now let me see if I can get my slides up for everybody. And I will go to slideshow. And I've got to back them all the way up. Evidently, I did not start them at the beginning today. All righty. So I'm going to assume right now that everyone can see the slides.
Not yet, Pat. I think you have to go down at the bottom and click share screen.
Oh, you know, I thought I had done that. Let me try again. Share screen.
If you hold your cursor over there at the bottom of what you're seeing, there should be a little green box that says share.
Oh, a green box. Okay, I see a red box. Oh dear. All right, let me see. Now that's pulling up, darn it. That's pulling up all of the people's names and your picture, but it's not pulling up the slides.
Okay,
So,
try that one more time. Look,
excuse me. I think I just saw it. All right, let's try this. Share. Now do you see?
Well, you'll there. Yep, now we do. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. You probably have all figured out I don't do Zoom very often, so this will be why this wasn't working so smoothly. I am going to try to move it into a full screen. Can you still see them?
Yes.
You can. All righty. I think we're all set to go. And obviously, the first thing I do want to say is that I don't have any conflict of interest to declare. And I'd like to quickly review the overall objectives for today. Much of the content today is really about skills that I'm sure all of you have, but that you may not have thought about them systematically or using some of the terminology of today's talk. So hopefully, again, we'll be giving you a useful frame. I'm going to talk about and differentiate 4 major types of supervisor roles or styles, and then pick some select concepts such as anticipatory guidance, which is the idea of how to set the relationship to maximize processes and outcomes. And also talk about a few specific strategies that can further enhance supervision. So I'd like to start off by saying that I think of supervision as being a relationship where you have 2 anxious people who are sitting down to have a conversation, and that you can only hope that the supervisor is the less anxious of the two people sitting down. And I start with that as kind of a joke, but it really is true that it's a very challenging and very important activity. And so anxiety is to be expected, and that hopefully as you are growing in your roles, you will be the person who has a little bit less anxiety during the encounters. A lot of what I'm going to do today has a basis in the idea of reflective practice. So I'm going to start off with something for all of you to do individually. I'd like you to take a minute and think about maybe the most helpful thing a supervisor ever did for you when you were training to be a genetic counselor. I'd like you to think about it, jot it down somewhere for yourself, and I'm going to ask you to consider bookmarking that as a goal for yourself to have when you're working with your students. So let me give you a minute to think about that. If you're still thinking about it, feel free to write it down as something comes to you. But I'm going to move along, and I think it's always nice to start with a consensus about just what the phenomena of supervision is. And you can see from this slide that supervision is very multi-purpose, multitask, multi-activity, that at various times we may be engaged in providing guidance, advice, support, sometimes giving a quick fix, paying attention to quality, and always, of course, the idea of supervision being an honest activity. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about feedback in a few minutes. Supervision is considered to be the linchpin of preparation in genetic counseling. I think we all know that it's great to read about something like crocheting or knitting or driving a car, but you'd never want to let somebody in a car who hadn't actually had some practice doing it. And so supervision really is about the, hands-on application of all of the learning that has come up to that point in a student's preparation. Part of what makes supervision challenging, especially for us as supervisors, is that we wear different hats at different times. Clearly, we're skill builders trying to help students develop minimal competencies. In your field, that would be the practice-based competencies. Be sure they have them and that they hold on to them, that they maintain them and use them. Also, supervisors serve as socializers. You have a very important role in helping to model or demonstrate to students just what is it to be a genetic counselor. Not only the skills and the service provision, but attitudes, ways of behaving, what's considered professional and not professional, for example. You also are the protectors, meaning that you have to ensure that the standard of care is being met for each and every patient or consumer that students work with. And very importantly, you also are gatekeepers for your profession, deciding who has the skills to enter into the field and also making those tough calls about those people who may not be appropriate for the profession. So at any one point in time, you're shifting the hats that you're wearing, and sometimes it's hard for students to understand where you're coming from. Personally, I've found that I try to tell students right now I'm moving into my protector role and I'm talking about the patient's welfare, or right now I'll say, well, I'm moving into like a focus on your skills. Let's talk about where you are with your growth and development. Here's a fancy definition that comes out of the mental health literature, but I think is pretty generic for all kinds of supervision. Essentially, Bernard and Goodyear say supervision is usually provided by a more senior member of a profession to more junior colleagues who typically, but not always, are members of the same profession or field. The relationship is evaluative. It extends over a certain time period, and it has all of those purposes that we've just talked about on the last two slides. Now shifting to one other sort of concept to set the stage for this work. A number of years ago, colleagues of mine and I developed a reciprocal engagement model of genetic counseling practice. And then more recently, we and a former student of ours proposed a model of supervision that we feel parallels the genetic counseling work. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There is a reference for this at the back of the slides if you're interested in reading more about it. But I do want to point out the idea that there's three major components: education, which ranges from genetics and biomedical information, to students being educated about case assessment, teaching or educational skills, and psychosocial counseling skills. The other component that plays a key role is the fact that both we and our students bring who we are into the room. And within that, we want to be particularly mindful as supervisors about supporting autonomy as much as possible with students, recognizing that overwhelmingly they are capable and that their emotions matter. In fact, I really believe that supervision can be as highly emotional an interaction as some of the most difficult genetic counseling cases that you may work with. All of these components combine in a reciprocal way through the relationship. And so I can't stress enough, setting a workable relationship that's characterized by trust and openness is one of your best goals to achieve in your work. If you're able to do all of that, then you're going to capitalize on your ability to help students learn to be independently providing effective services, developing professionally, and engaging in self-reflective practice. And I'm going to use that word self-reflective more than once here, because I believe that all of us as professionals need to be learning how to engage in self-supervision as a lifetime pursuit. The day comes when no one but patients may see what students are doing, and it's really important that we can be our own gatekeepers and socializers and quality control agents. Another useful concept I think that helps to bring down this huge, activity of supervision is some research that Hart and Nance did, where they looked across supervision in all different kinds of human service fields, and they found that two major dynamics in differing degrees happen in all supervision relationships and interactions, and they called those support and direction. And the way they define those is to say that when we're being supportive supervisors, we're focusing on the students' concerns about themselves, their thoughts and their feelings about their work, about their patients, their own professional development, their own professional challenges. Direction, on that continuum, it's more of a focus on conceptualizing the patients, case preparation, practicing and trying out counseling techniques, debriefing around how the counseling went for the patient. Thinking about support and guidance and how they're available and actually occur in all supervision relationships, I now want to give you another, what I call a heuristic, or a way of thinking about how we are as supervisors in our work. And within these roles, which I'll quickly define and then give you an example, I think you'll be figuring out as I go through them that there's varying emphases on whether a supervisor is being supportive or whether they're being more of a guider or director. So first one is what I would call a consultation role or style, where the interactions between us and our students are very collaborative. The objectives for the rotation, for the day, for a patient tend to be mutually developed by the supervisor and student. And you really encourage self-evaluation and trying to, in a sense, be a team, co-working on the counseling services. Things that you might be doing if you're taking a consultation role are brainstorming possible strategies and interventions with the student, generating options for the patient, figuring out patient needs together. This is a role also where, as a supervisor, you'd be more comfortable self-disclosing about your own clinical experiences, your own experiences as a student. I like to say both those great successes and those times when we went down in flames with our mistakes. You're a facilitator, again, trying to work very collegially with the student. And typically, students that have a little more experience like this kind of role because they've got a bit of a basis under them for having done some of the counseling work. And I think they appreciate being able to share what they know or think they know. So the second role, and this one really probably fits very, very comfortably given the educational emphasis of a lot of your work, is the idea of supervisor as teacher, where your primary interaction is instruction. And you are more or less seen as the resource person, where you're sharing your knowledge, your skills, your strategies. You might be doing things like demonstrating for a student how to take a pedigree, explaining a concept like mitochondrial inheritance, interpreting interactions that happened with the patient. In this particular role or style, I think it is where you are seen as very much the expert, so in more of a power seat. And I do think that the teaching role often, but not always, is favored by very novice students who really are eager for just any kind of structure for the work that they're about to do. But I also want to say that within the teaching role, there's different ways to go about being a teacher. And I think what I've described so far fits more with this idea of directive teaching, where you lead by telling, meaning that a lot of the work of supervision, a lot of those answers, a lot of those strategies are coming from you. Either you're telling a student an answer, you're telling a student where to find an answer, or you're modeling or showing a student how to do something. And while that can be very, very effective, there is also the reality that often when we directively tell, students know what they're supposed to say or do, but they may not understand why, and they may not even really understand how to go about doing it. So supervision kind of loses the bi-directional process that I like to encourage, given that it's a relationship, not a tutorial. Now, contrast that to a more of what I call an evocative teaching role, where more as the supervisor, you're leading by following. And what I mean by that is that when possible, starting from the student's perspective is the way to lead by following. Saying to the student, what do you think went well? What might you have done differently? After that, you can add your own perspective and or shape or correct or reinforce what the student has said themselves. But why this is such a great approach when it's feasible is that it's promoting students' skill development. It's strengthening their self-reflection skills, helping them self-supervise. It's building their confidence that they actually within them have the answers, even at in the moment with the patient, they may not have known what to say or do. It encourages independent functioning. And honestly, because it makes it more of a shared endeavor, I like to say you don't have to work as hard as a supervisor. I find myself often saying to supervisors, don't work so hard. You've got a partner there in the student. A couple of caveats though, if you're thinking about this role or style, or if it is one that you use, this may be something that you've experienced, is that it's important to explain that you're using this kind of an approach because you're working with very bright students who very quickly figure out, you never answer my questions. You always answer my question with a question. And so it's important that students understand that you're not going to leave them hanging if they can't come up with a good idea. And it's not a gotcha game. You're not sort of baiting them to have them come up with the answer that you think is the right one. So you want to have a bit of a conversation about it and also recognize on an ongoing way that students will have some anxiety about this approach. I mean, I guess we all like quick fixes, but we realize that in the long run, it may not be the best for our development. So third role is counseling role. And this is one where the interactions focus a lot on the promotion of self-awareness, especially around helping students recognize their feelings, their thoughts that maybe they haven't verbalized, their reactions, their defenses, their own dynamics that they bring with them. And developmental tasks would be another good example. I sometimes think that every new student thinks they're the only one who's terrified to walk into the room with that first client, or that every student thinks that they're the only one having kind of grieving about the termination as their 2-year program comes to an end, not only because they're saying goodbye, but because in many ways they don't feel like they're ready to go. So conversations about those sorts of things and normalizing those would be part of the counseling role. Now, I want to be real clear here about why recognizing these internal reactions or defenses is important, and then what you do with them. Especially, I want to make clear that this is not psychotherapy. Your role is to help students become aware. Your role also is to help them figure out how that's affected the way they're working in their clinical services. And your role is to help them manage those kinds of reactions and feelings the next time they occur. It's not to help them change things like having issues with highly dominant males in a prenatal genetic counseling session because in their own family of origin, they had difficulty with authoritative parents or relatives. So again, the point is bring it to awareness, discuss its clinical ramifications, figure out a way to work with it in clinic. If it's a bigger issue and one that's not being managed, providing resources of where they could go to work that through with someone else. This particular style or role doesn't tend to occur as frequently. I think especially in highly time-limited supervision, like the work of genetic counseling. But when it does, it's very salient and can be very powerful. And then finally, the evaluation role, which in a way is always there, but it's most obviously there when we as supervisors are in the business of formal mid-rotation evaluations, end of rotation evaluations, and when we're in the process of giving feedback and discussing that with students. It's also probably there when we're setting goals early on in the rotation and then reevaluating those goals as time goes on. Ideally, what we would be talking about as evaluators is the student's work, the services they're providing, and also the supervision relationship itself. Although I will say we've done one study where we found that genetic counseling students perceive that discussion of the relationship with the supervisor doesn't happen very often. Hopefully that's because the relationships are going really, really well. But it may also be just that we don't think about bringing up the relationship. And I will say that it's the rare student who would bring up the relationship. The onus is on us to have those kind of touch points about how things are going. I've very quickly run through 4 roles or styles. Hopefully, as you've been hearing those, you've been thinking, oh, that sounds like me, or oh, that really doesn't sound like me. But to bring these a little more to life, I wanted to give one quick example and point out that in any interaction, you have a choice about which role to step into. So here's the scenario. Your student participated in a session where the patient started to cry when he heard the diagnostic results. And when that happened, the student started to rapidly repeat information about his prognosis, probably more times than necessary, and again, very, very quickly. So let's look at some of these example responses and be thinking if you can identify which of the roles each illustrates. So you might say to the student, here's what I would say to empathize with him. Or you might say, what might you have said to empathize with him? Or you could say, when my patients cry, my first impulse is to want to say something to ease their pain, partly because I'm feeling the pain as well. Let's talk about some ways to be supportive. Or you could say, maybe his feelings felt threatening to you. Let's talk about that. Or you could say, I think you could try working on modifying your timing and your pacing. Let's talk about how you could do that. So take a look at them and see if you can kind of put one role beside each one. It should represent the 4 roles, including the 2 teaching ones that I talked about. Well, here's the answer key. Hopefully, Although these roles sometimes can be a little fuzzy, you would see that the first two were two different ways to be a teacher. The third one, the consultant, especially given the self-disclosure in that response. Counselor, because it was trying to explore and bring into awareness those internal feelings. And of course, then evaluator, being very precise about specific skills and how to improve upon those. You know, in a way, I would like to think that a conversation around that scenario would involve all 5 of these responses. But even with that, wherever you start with one of these responses, it may very well affect where you go from there. So it's all about timing and choosing. And that's another one of those challenges that makes supervision an interesting and tough thing to do. A few other comments about these roles or styles. The roles do overlap. It isn't like you're 100% a counselor, then you're 100% a consultant. Very, very important to know, it isn't that one role is better than another. Ideally, we are all versatile enough to pick that role that is most appropriate in that situation with that student, with that particular patient. Another really important thing to know is that either person in the relationship can pull for one of the roles. And this is where you may get into problems or conflicts if you're wanting to be an evocative teacher, for example, and the student wants you to be a directive teacher. That's grounds for conversation and discussion about that, because that really can cause a lot of conflict and limit how much a student gets out of the experience. The other thing to know too about these roles is that we all tend to favor one or maybe 2 of them, either ones that we experienced when we were supervisees or ones that are just more comfortable for us. This is not an issue of apologizing, it's an issue about knowing what your preferred role or style is, and a good idea to let the student know. I would also suggest that when you are in the early stages of supervision with the student, see if you can figure out which role they're pulling for. That will give you a lot of important information about how things are going to play out if you can figure out what their preferences are. Quick now shifting to what I really think is a major component of supervision that has a lot of influence on setting the tone of how things are going to go. And I call it prepping for supervision, much like you would prep for counseling sessions. And it's very much about anticipatory guidance. So if you have a pen or pencil, a piece of paper there, or if you're just really good at remembering things in your head, I would like you to think about some critical questions that would be important to you. And I'd like you to try to think of 5 things or 5 questions that you would want to know about a student before you actually start the supervision relationship with them. And if you've got pad and paper or pencil, write them down. Keep writing or thinking if you still are. And as you're doing that, I'm going to suggest that if these questions matter to you, it probably doesn't take more than a few minutes to turn those into an email and send those to a student prior to starting the rotation with them, and ask them if they would provide some brief answers, or tell them here's 5 questions you'd like to discuss with them the first time you have a face-to-face or Zoom interaction. And it can be a great way to begin to set some of that rapport. I think it's very analogous to a little bit of rapport building you may do with patients before you launch heavily into the genetic counseling work with them in a session. Now I'm going to turn it around and ask you to think about 5 things or 5 questions that students would want to know before they start a supervision relationship with you. And I'm going to ask you again, write down or think about the 5 questions. Okay, again, keep writing or keep thinking about that as you wish. What I would suggest with these is that you could presume that these are questions that students have, and you could voluntarily share this information with them. And in a few slides, we're going to see some ways to do that more formally. Or you could email a student and say, you know, I'd like to know a little bit about you. And one of the things I would like to know is what questions you have for me. Would you send me 5 questions that you have? And I would recommend that you limit the number of questions you ask them to send. Otherwise, it could turn into a pretty big task. But 5 questions that you could either try to write a response back to the student or again, have a conversation with them during your first encounter. I think themes that underlie all the questions, I will bet that this is the case for you, that you wrote in terms of questions you have and questions students have, is that there's these meta questions. Probably at the highest level as supervisors, we most want to know if students are skilled enough or will be skilled enough by the end of a rotation. And we want to know whether they're going to say or do anything that's going to hurt the patients. Students, on the other hand, or perhaps analogously, are most concerned about whether supervisors were going to help them and are we going to hurt them. And I think that goes back to some of that anxiety that I said is so characteristic of supervision relationships. And I think it's anxiety that can be lessened the more we grow to trust each other in the relationship. So hopefully some of the things that I'm presenting here and that you're going to hear in subsequent weeks are going to help with that trust building. Also wanted to give you, and I'm not going to read these, but they're in your slide packet, some sample supervisor questions. They're not exhaustive, but they are illustrative, and you can just have those and maybe compare them to the ones that you thought about. And I'm also going to give you some sample student questions. Now, I'm going to back up for a second and say you have one slide with, about 10 supervisor questions. The next slides have about 45 questions. When I've asked students to brainstorm what they'd like to know about supervision, it's an overwhelming number of questions. What I really like about that is it suggests to me how eager they are to get it right. They really, really want to do well. So again, I'm not going to read through these. I might pick out 1 or 2 as I blow through these slides. But clearly a huge piece is all around feedback. How you give me feedback, when you give me feedback, what that feedback's about. They're curious about things like what to do in the downtime, what to do if a patient doesn't show. They don't really want to sit and do nothing, but they may not be sure what they could be doing instead. Questions about whether they'll ever get to do a whole session, either with you or without you in the room. Big questions around the step-ins. That's a huge one. Students really want to know, when do you step in? Why do you step in? What does it mean? How am I going to get the session back if you step in? How do I let you know that I need help? So a lot of these things that if they're addressed anticipatorily in advance can really, when they happen, make it a much more smoother experience. Questions around charting, around case prep. One that I love to ask is when I ask students, how long do you think it takes to do a case prep? They'll say, hours. When I ask experienced supervisors, how long does it take you to do a case prep? I hear things like, about 15 minutes. The questions around how long for a case prep and how will I know if I'm making progress toward more of that 15-minute model as opposed to hours and hours? Recommended resources and materials. How to get a hold of you in an emergency. What's the best way to contact you? So just lots and lots of questions. And I look at these and I think, over the years as a supervisor, it's the same questions. And so maybe thinking about ways to have answers that I can more efficiently give to students rather than having the same conversation over and over and over again. And so one way to think about doing that is to take some of those student questions and some of the things that we feel students would benefit from knowing and do a written disclosure statement. That could be done individually. It could be done among all the supervisors at a site if you have multiple supervisors there. And what is really nice about a disclosure statement is that it does provide some structure. It stimulates and invites student questions. It helps to ensure that both of you are on the same page about what's happening and how it's happening and why. It helps to formalize the relationship. It educates students more about what supervision is all about. And what I really like to think at the most practical level is at 2 o'clock in the morning when a student has 104-degree fever, they can look at this statement and see how they're supposed to let you know that, rather than having to try to make it up from memory. So disclosure statements can be very, very effective. And it also is nice because it helps us remember what are the key elements that we should be telling students about. Sometimes we forget. So I'd ask you to just take a second here or a couple of minutes. And if you were going to write a written information form or disclosure statement for yourself, what do you think you would include? Okay, maybe you thought about some of these things which are recommended in literature on supervision disclosure statements. One is just a description of who you are, your credentials, your qualifications, the kind of patient populations or genetic counseling populations that you've worked with. A whole other section would be on practical issues and logistics. How often do we have supervision? How long? You know, is it 5 minutes at the water cooler between patients? Is it 15 minutes at the end of the day? Where do we meet for supervision? Again, how do I contact you in an emergency? What's your counseling style? Supervision process, the different methods and formats, when, where, how, why you provide feedback. The types of skills you'll be emphasizing with the student, the roles and responsibilities each of you have in the relationship. Administrative issues like, what am I evaluated on, when and where? Not at all a bad idea to attach the evaluation form right to the disclosure statement. Typically programs provide that, and that would be the thing to tack to the back of your information sheet. Due process issues. What if the student has a major concern and they are unable to rectify that with you? Who do they turn to? And then of course, a huge area of ethical and legal issues, not only around patient services, but also regarding themselves. What are the limits to confidentiality? I find that students either tend to think supervisors say nothing to anybody about the supervision, or they think supervisors are telling everybody everything. They just really don't know unless you give them some parameters. How you're going to deal with different things like the policies of the agency and being sure the students are in compliance with those. So those are the broad general categories. I'm going to quickly go through these because these slides are a resource for you for later, but this is just one example of what a disclosure sheet or information sheet might look like. And you feel free to use any or all of it, or come up with your own. Sometimes too, you can even be fairly formal and at the end of the statement, ask a student to sign off that they have read it, have addressed any questions with you about it, and that they're agreeing to what's been described. And you would sign off on it and date it as well. That's useful in the very rare event where something legal might come up, where a student would say, well, you never told me X, Y, or Z, and you can point to the statement and say, well, actually, it's right here. Shifting quickly. Another aspect of supervision that I think is an important one is creating that working alliance, which is about the supervision relationship. Building it and recognizing and managing the kind of dynamics that play out, because people were very complex and relationships can be messy. What helps to keep the relationship less messy? I think things like trying to be as consistent and transparent as we can as supervisors. If we say we do things a certain way, we do them that way. We don't set a goal one day and change it the next day. Speaking of goals, we try to mutually work with the student to create the goals for the rotation. Those goals should focus on specific a behavior as we can get to, and the number of goals should be reasonable in scope and number. Obviously, you can't work equally on all 22 or 23 practice-based competencies, but there may be certain ones that are particularly relevant for your setting and for the student. So figuring out with the student what can be realistically accomplished and reassessing that periodically throughout the rotation, because goals can change as a student develops. One quick specific suggestion: ask your student to identify 2 goals based on the feedback that they had from their last rotation, or if it's a first rotation, just based on what they expect might be areas where they would need a little more growth and work. That tip, by the way, is another example of evocative teaching. Other ways we create and manage the working alliance. I said about managing dynamics. I love this statement from a psychotherapist that I ran across one time, who said, we all carry around baggage from our lives. We just need to be sure we know what's in the bags. And this is the truth. We bring the bags into the supervision room and we bring them into the counseling setting. So knowing what's in the bags is a major step toward managing what's in those bags as supervisors and as service providers to clients or patients. Just as an example, I thought about what are some typical cognitive traps I've heard over the years from both supervisors and counselors alike. First of all, that we feel we have to have all the answers. As supervisors, we think it's completely our fault if a student messes up. Or conversely, we think it's completely the student's fault if they mess up. Personally, I believe it's maybe always a little bit of both, sometimes more on one person than the other, but nevertheless, that students should just know what we expect. That students always have to do it our way. That, by the way, is my favorite one. I really try not to think that and act on it, but there are times when I think, why don't you just do it my way? It would be so much easier. But another one would be being liked is more important than being respected. That we should just know what our students need. And that we must be in control of the supervision conversation at all times. You might want to look quickly at those and see if any of those resonate with you. And if they do, why don't you just kind of make a note for yourself that these are 1 or 2 of those cognitive traps to watch out for, to just know that it's there and figure out a way that you're going to manage it. Another aspect of the working alliance that's so important, and there's been elements of that in what we've talked about with like the supervision disclosure statements, is the notion of maintaining clear professional boundaries. And the onus is on us as the supervisors. We are in the more powerful role. We are the more experienced individuals. It's responsible for us to set and maintain the boundaries. Let me have you just consider each of these and just be thinking to yourself how appropriate you think each of these behaviors is for you as a supervisor. First, you agree to serve on your supervisee's thesis committee. You allow your supervisee to treat you to coffee. You ask your supervisee to nominate you for an award. You lend your supervisee some money. You borrow some money from your supervisee. You attend your supervisee's wedding. You ask your supervisee to buy Girl Scout cookies from your daughter. If all of those make you pause a little bit and maybe even feel slightly uncomfortable, you're getting the point that these are places where it's easy to say maintain a boundary, and in practice, it can get really kind of fuzzy and muddled. We could spend a whole hour on boundaries, which obviously we aren't going to do today. But I do want to say, in terms of those items, we wouldn't all agree necessarily on how appropriate or not appropriate they are. But I think 2 good strategies, anytime we're thinking twice about an action of ours, is to first start by saying, would I be okay if what I did or what I'm considering doing was published on the front page of the newspaper? In other words, be fine for everybody to know this is something that I say and do. And very, very importantly, to seek consultation and peer support. Anytime there's questions about boundaries, which is really an ethical question, it's important to seek consultation. The other thing I want to quickly mention is that the ways that we can sometimes cross boundaries and then violate boundaries is important to think about. One major category is when we're in what I call multiple relationships. In an academic setting, they're very common. You're supervising a student, you're teaching them in a class, you're on their master's committee for their master's project. Those are very, very appropriate. They're expected kinds of boundary crossings. And it's just a matter of articulating those relationships and trying to keep them as separate as possible. Boundary violations are where we step over into realms where we could lose our objectivity in evaluating a student, and we could be guilty of coercion. Social relationships. You invite your student out to lunch. Probably okay, but can you really be sure if the student didn't want to do that? They'd say no. So the idea that we might be coercive, or asking students for favors. Would you please, pick up my coffee for me in the morning? Maybe okay, or exploitative, and the student feels they have to do it. So this is where consultation can help very much with those fuzzy sorts of things. Some writers in this area suggest that if you have pre-existing social relationships with students, you suspend those during the time that you're supervising them. While you're supervising them, don't start social relationships. Again, we could spend an hour, but hopefully you're getting the idea that prudence and conservative approaches is probably the best bet. One last big aspect of aspects of supervision is feedback, which really is much of the work of supervision. A distinguishing feature in supervision is that we can and should tell students what we actually think about their behavior. We need to do it in ways that's beneficial. I really like an evocative approach to feedback when feasible. The way that I tend to do this is I will say to my students at the outset of supervision relationship, and then I will do this, is that after every case or whenever we're debriefing on a case, I'll ask you to begin by identifying one thing you thought went well, one thing that didn't go as well, and then I'll share my impression of one thing that went well and not as well, and then let's work together to figure out what you might do differently. Feedback, again, is one of these complex kinds of behaviors. There's always issues of timing and choosing on our part. And I like to think about it with these 4 questions and try to think of these questions as I can when I'm in the work of supervising. First of all, deciding, does something have to be said? Deciding, does it have to be said by me? In other words, am I going to say it directly, or am I going to try to evoke and have the student tell me? Does this have to be talked about now, which is timing? And does it have to be said this way, the manner or the approach? A few very, very general considerations on feedback. Work very hard to go beyond you saying to a student, you did a good job, because that tells them nothing other than it didn't do a bad one. Try to avoid just going, well, that was bad, or that didn't work, or somehow giving that implication, because it doesn't tell them what to do instead. When we're in the business of corrective feedback, yeah, you point out what happened, you point out the ramifications, but that's not enough. Now, what's the student going to do the next time? Precise feedback, as behavioral as possible. Balanced, I like to say no one ever does a perfect session and no one totally ruins it. So positive and corrective. And there's that word honesty again. I doubt you'd ever withhold critical information from a patient unless they refuse to receive it. Well, the same with students. We need to not hold back and withhold from them. It really cheats them from the experience. And the last couple of slides are around, in some ways, many of the things we've already talked about, but this notion of being efficiently effective, because you're busy people, tight schedules. And here's just a few tips and suggestions. Schedule and protect at least some of the supervision time. Make that sacrosanct, barring an emergency, because it's too easy to let a week, 2 weeks go by, and what a shame, what a loss for the student and you. Create that student information sheet where you ask students to tell you a little about themselves in advance. Creating the supervision disclosure statement where you give students some information about you and the parameters of the work. Giving students copies of your notes if you take notes during supervision. Sloppy or not, students can take those away and digest them, look at them and reconsider them. Recognizing and being okay with the idea that imitation is a very necessary part of how to learn the skills. It's not enough, but it's a great part of the way students learn. And so here's some strategies to help students imitate. Give them examples of a case prep. Give them examples of patient letters. Have them come into your setting prior to the rotation to learn the layout. Ask them to come in and observe sessions, if possible, if you can do this at your site, at least once or twice before they even start rotating. Doing mini role plays to allow students to see how to do something. Video recording sessions, usually not possible with real patients, but again, role playing with you or with classmates so they can review and critique their own behavior. And then a couple of final comments, and then I'm going to open the floor here for a few questions. I do want to say, as a wrap up of all of this, is that I truly believe none of the students come into your field with the goal of hurting as many patients as possible. Yes, they may exercise poor judgment, act out because they're stressed, misperceive the impact of some of their behavior, but they really want to do well. And so I say, expect the best till proven otherwise. And to elaborate on that a bit, I really think that if you treat patients, students the way you treat your patients for the most part, you'll usually have good outcomes. By that, I mean expecting they're there for the right reasons, trust their ability and resilience, recognize how emotional a process supervision is, celebrate students' victories, however small they are. They may be small to you, but they're really big to the student, and delivering your bad news, big corrective feedback with clarity and compassion. So I have thrown a lot at you. We have a few minutes according to my watch. Let me invite anybody to chat in with a question and we'll see what we can cover as a group. And I'm going to minimize these slides so I can see my chat button, hopefully.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Anybody want to chime in with a question? I had asked you to do so via the chat bar, but feel free. I think there's, there's 27 of us. So if you do want to unmute yourself, go ahead and do that and just introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask a question that way.
Great. Their heads may be spinning. I know that went fast.
Well, I think it was just such a great overview on all the different roles that we can take, and particularly around developing the disclosure statement and creating a working alliance and the different ways to do feedback, because I feel as if that is a really difficult area when you're trying to help somebody, is to know exactly how to say something and the most sensitive way to say something. And I think your suggestion about being very precise and giving them some examples is really important to take away.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, corrective feedback is very difficult. We don't like to feel like we're hurting people. But at some level, corrective feedback does feel painful when we get it, but it's so necessary. And I've heard students more than once say, yeah, that corrective feedback is hard, but I want it because I feel like I'm being cheated if the supervisor doesn't help me know what to improve. Relatedly too, I would think there again, if you try first by evoking corrective feedback from the student, if they're able to touch on it at all, it's going to make them more open to hearing it from you when you step in and say that you agree, or when you expand or elaborate on it.
Right. And I think it's important for the students to discuss about what they think went well first as well. I feel like they're so hard on themselves, and yes, it's almost a lesson in learning how to understand that most of the things they did do well, and accepting that and kind of praising themselves for that first before moving on into the areas of that. And I know some students who will come and say, I don't need any of that sandwich stuff, just tell me what I did wrong. But I feel as if that's missing the point too, because we all need it. We all need to hear the things that we've done well.
Well, I talk about the fact that, does everybody know the sandwich technique? Positive statement, corrective statement, positive statement. I actually do what I call an open face sandwich. I start positive comment. To me, the filling, like the hummus or the meat, is the corrective. And then the toppings are, what are you going to do differently? And that kind of gets away from that feeling that now I'm being gratuitous by giving another positive compliment at the end. No, it's not. I don't think it's necessary. It's Positive, corrective, now what are you going to do about it? And I do want to follow up on how important it is for us to listen when we say to students, let's talk about what you did well. And the students go right to all the stuff they did wrong. That we have to really call them on that and stop them and slow them up and not let them get away with that. Insist on positive. And then also to stop them and have them really celebrate things that I think they take for granted. The skills of genetic counseling are really hard. Most people on this planet can't do it, but students somehow think, that old thing, now let's get on to the important stuff, what went wrong. Not a great way to be developing professionally, just for a lot of reasons.
I think that's very well said, and something that we can all remember, because you're absolutely right. Some of these things that come easy don't come easy to us as a profession, don't come easy to other people. And it's a really special person that can do this.
Exactly.
So I think it seems as if you did such a great job explaining everything that there are a few questions. So I just want to say thank you so much for giving of your time and for helping us all learn. And I want to thank everybody who joined the webinar for attending, and let you all know that you can expect that quiz. We'll email that out to you. We'll also email out the evaluations on this particular module. And I will, at Pat's request, I will send everybody a copy of all the slides that she used, as well as this recording. And I just want to also remind you all that the second part of our series will be on Friday, October 18th, at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, with Crystal Hill Chapman, who will discuss self-regulation in genetic counseling supervision. So thank you very much, everyone, for spending the time and giving your time Friday to help make lives for our students better, and just our genetic counseling colleagues.
And anybody, feel free to contact me if you have any questions or want to follow up on anything we covered today. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Bye.